A secret tape, a chilling confession, and two men left terrified by an encounter with the unknown. On the night of October 11th, 1973, two friends went fishing on the banks of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. What was supposed to be a relaxing evening became one of the most famous, bizarre, and unsettling alien abduction stories ever recorded. This is the story of the Pascagoula incident, an event that would haunt the lives of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker forever. Charles Hickson, age 42, and Calvin Parker, age 18, started out the night like any other. They worked together at a shipyard and decided to head out for some fishing after a long day on the job. The air was cool, the night calm. The two men settled at an old pier, cast their lines into the water, and chatted quietly. But soon, everything changed. Out of nowhere, a strange blue light lit up the area around them. Calvin turned to see what he thought were the flashing lights of a police car. Maybe they were trespassing, he thought. But when he looked up, his eyes widened in shock. It wasn't a police car. Hovering above the river was an oval-shaped craft about 30 feet long and 8 feet high. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before, with pulsating blue lights and a faint humming sound. Before Calvin could even process what was happening, a door on the craft opened, and three strange beings emerged. The creatures were about 5 feet tall, with wrinkled gray skin. They had no necks. Their heads seemed to sit directly on their shoulders. Instead of hands, they had pincer-like claws, and their legs didn't appear to have feet. They moved in an eerie, mechanical way, almost as if they were gliding across the ground rather than walking. Calvin was frozen in terror, and when he looked over at Charles, he saw that his friend was just as petrified. Before they could react, the creatures grabbed them. Calvin and Charles felt an overwhelming sense of paralysis, as if their bodies were no longer under their control. The beings lifted them effortlessly and carried them toward the craft. Calvin tried to scream, but no sound came out. The men were completely at the mercy of these strange visitors. Once inside the craft, things only got stranger. Calvin recalled being placed on a flat, metallic surface. He couldn't move, but he could see out of the corner of his eye that Charles was on a similar table nearby. Calvin felt a strange sensation, almost like his mind was being probed, as if these beings were trying to read his thoughts. Charles later described a similar experience. The beings themselves didn't speak, at least not verbally, but both men said they felt a kind of communication, a mental connection that was difficult to describe. It was as if the creatures were able to convey their intentions directly into their minds. He recalled being paralyzed but fully conscious as the beings performed what he interpreted as a medical examination. A mechanical eye, roughly 8 inches in diameter, scanned his body while he was aboard the craft. Hickson believed the eye-like device was conducting a thorough examination. Parker, in his revised account, claimed he was also examined aboard the spacecraft, but his description was more personal and bizarre. He said that a petite, female alien took particular interest in his below the belt area during the examination. And just as suddenly as it all began, it was over. The beings carried them back outside and set them down on the riverbank, right where they had been before. The craft ascended silently, disappearing into the night sky. Calvin and Charles were left stunned, disoriented, and terrified. The men sat in silence for a few moments, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Calvin was shaking uncontrollably, and Charles, though trying to stay calm, was clearly in shock. Eventually, they decided they had to tell someone. They drove to the local sheriff's office and reported the incident. When they arrived, the deputies were skeptical. Two men claiming to have been abducted by aliens. It sounded ridiculous. But as Calvin and Charles described what had happened, the deputies couldn't ignore the genuine fear in their voices. Here's where things get interesting. The sheriff decided to leave the two men alone in a room, secretly recording their conversation to see if they would slip up or admit to making it all up. Instead, what the recording captured was two terrified men struggling to process an experience that seemed beyond comprehension. The significance of the secret tape cannot be overstated. The fear in their voices, the way they spoke to each other when they thought no one was listening, it all pointed to the fact that something very real had happened to them that night. This recording became a key piece of evidence supporting their story, convincing many skeptics that the men truly believed in what they had experienced. The story quickly made headlines, and soon, the small town of Pascagoula was swarmed by reporters, UFO enthusiasts, and skeptics. Calvin and Charles became reluctant celebrities, their faces plastered across newspapers and TV screens. Charles, being the older of the two, seemed more willing to talk about what had happened. He gave interviews, appeared on talk shows, and even wrote a book about the experience. Calvin, on the other hand, wanted nothing more than to forget the whole ordeal. He suffered from anxiety and nightmares and avoided the spotlight as much as possible. But the Pascagoula incident wasn't just a story of two men and their strange encounter. Over time, more witnesses came forward. People who had been near the river that night reported seeing strange lights in the sky. One woman, Maria Blair, said that she and her husband had seen a blue light hovering over the river around the same time that Calvin and Charles were allegedly abducted. She even claimed to have had her own bizarre encounter involving missing time and strange visions, though she kept these details to herself for many years. Maria Blair's detailed experience added another layer of mystery to the Pascagoula incident. She described seeing the blue light, feeling disoriented, and later realizing that she had experienced missing time. These strange occurrences mirrored what Calvin and Charles had gone through, lending further credibility to their story and suggesting that something truly unusual had happened that night. The Pascagoula abduction is often referred to as one of the most credible alien abduction cases in history, partly because of the physical evidence that seemed to support the men's story. Both Calvin and Charles passed polygraph tests, and medical examinations showed signs of physical trauma consistent with their account. After the incident, both men had small puncture marks on their arms, which they suggested could be from some kind of injection by the beings. Skeptics, of course, have their own theories. Some suggest that the men could have experienced a shared hallucination, possibly brought on by stress or exhaustion. Others believe that it was an elaborate hoax, though neither Calvin nor Charles seem to have anything to gain from making up such a story. In fact, the attention they received brought more hardship than benefit, particularly for Calvin, who struggled with the psychological impact for years. Then there's the theory of sleep paralysis, a condition where a person is awake but unable to move, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations. Some believe that the men might have experienced a form of sleep paralysis while fishing, leading them to imagine the entire encounter. But this explanation doesn't account for the physical marks on their bodies, or the fact that they both experienced the same thing at the same time. As the years went by, Calvin and Charles tried to move on with their lives. Charles continued to speak publicly about the incident, maintaining until his death in 2011 that everything he described was true. Calvin, who had kept mostly quiet for decades, eventually decided to share his story in full. In 2018, he published a book detailing his experience, hoping to finally find some closure. In his later interviews, Calvin spoke about how difficult it was to live with the memory of that night. He said that he often wished he could forget it, that he could go back to being the person he was before. But the experience had changed him. He described feeling disconnected from the world, as if a part of him had been left behind on that strange craft. He also mentioned that, over the years, he had experienced other strange occurrences, odd lights in the sky, a sense of being watched, things that made him wonder if the beings who took him that night were still keeping an eye on him. The Pascagoula incident remains a mystery. Was it genuine contact with beings from another world? We may never know for sure, but what makes this story so compelling is not just the details of the encounter itself, but the effect it had on those who experienced it. Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson were ordinary men, living ordinary lives, until something extraordinary happened to them, something that would change them forever, and they aren't alone. The Pascagoula abduction is just one of many strange encounters, reported around the world. Stories of abductions, missing time, and strange beings have been told for decades, each one adding another layer to the mystery of what might be out there. Are these stories just the result of overactive imaginations, or is there something more to them? Are we being visited by beings from another world? Beings who can take us without warning, examine us, and then return us as if nothing happened? The Pascagoula incident forces us to confront these questions, to consider the possibility that we are not alone. There's no denying that something happened to Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson on that October night in 1973, something that left them forever changed, haunted by the memory of what they saw, what they felt, and what they could not explain. So, the next time you find yourself near a quiet riverbank at night, casting your line into the dark waters below, remember the story of Calvin and Charles. Remember the strange blue light, the beings with wrinkled skin, and the feeling of being completely powerless. And ask yourself, if it happened to them, could it happen to you? Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the world of the strange and unexplained. Until next time, keep your eyes on the sky. You never know what you might see.